In my mind, the more concerning thing is the information that's been coming in from off-site lately. Some friends of mine are biologists that had worked at Chernobyl and went to Japan to do some scientific work over there. They went anticipating things were going to be bad. I got a call this week from them and they said, you know, things are really, really bad. So these are hardened scientists who are used to dealing with radiation, and they believe that conditions at Fukushima are much worse than they had thought. Now there's some corroborating evidence that's come in on that. The first is that mushrooms about 30 miles from the reactor, between 30 and 40 miles from the reactor, are found to be contaminated well in excess of what the Japanese are allowing. Now the interesting part of that is that the mushrooms were grown indoors. So how can a mushroom grown indoors exceed the radiation standards that the Japanese have set? It's a major concern, and again, it's 35 miles from the accident. The second piece of corroborating evidence is that cattle have been contaminated throughout the Fukushima prefecture and beyond. In the last week, at first it started that 8 cows were contaminated, and then it became 40 cows, and now it's over 130 cows that are contaminated. And I'm sure that number will go up as time goes on. Well, it turns out that the Japanese use rice, the stalks of rice, to feed their cows. And farmers out at 45 miles and beyond were cutting their rice stalks down and shipping it into the farms that were inside the Fukushima prefecture. And the straw was contaminated to 500,000 disintegrations every second in a kilogram of straw. Now this is cesium, it's got a 30-year half-life, but 30 years from now, it's still going to be disintegrating at 250,000 disintegrations per second. And 30 years after that, at 125,000 disintegrations per second. Now, this occurred out at 45 miles. You'll recall the Nuclear Regulatory Commission suggested evacuation out beyond 50 miles. And this appears to indicate that the NRC was right. The Japanese should have evacuated their population out beyond 50 miles and instead stopped at around 12 to 18 miles. Now, this contamination then has spread beyond the Fukushima prefecture, yet the prefecture itself seems to be the only place that the Japanese are worried about this radioactive exposure.
I just tested. I live in Bozeman, Montana, and a few minutes ago I just tested my meter, and we're at 0.22 millisieverts, okay? And there's 1,000 millisieverts to a sievert. And this thing is kicking out 530 sieverts an hour. Well, just so you know, if you get 5 sieverts, that's considered almost guaranteed that you're going to be dealing with more than a lethal dose of 50. Lethal dose of 50 means 50% of the population exposed to a given amount of radiation is going to die. The combined amount of cesium-137 contained in those nuclear fuel rods is 14,000 times greater than what was released when the U.S. dropped the atomic bombs in Hiroshima at the end of World War II. And what's imperative that everyone understands is there's a little statement called food first. If you go into the newspapers of Europe, they're running out of vegetables or just being priced out of the stratosphere. The amount of radioactivity that's being released out of Fukushima is also being carried around the world still in the upper atmosphere. Fallout literally means that after a certain amount of time, radioactive particulate matter begins to fall out of the atmosphere. If it's carried into the jet stream or carried into the winds aloft, it will fall out. But that fallout is still radioactive. Everybody focuses on cesium-137 bad enough. But when you're dealing with the issue of ingested cesium, in other words, you're eating this stuff, you're drinking this stuff, or you're, breathing this stuff, ingested radionuclides have a whole different mortality than just the exposure to the gamma or the beta radiation that comes off, beta and gamma being the worst. So when we're talking about 20 to 40 trillion becquerels of radioactive tritium that have gotten into the Pacific Oceans since the Fukushima disaster first began. And what's astonishing, we've got the classic manifestation of radiation poisoning in the fish. They're bleeding from their gills, bellies, and eyeballs, yet no one will make the simple A plus B equals C. Or in this case, A plus B doesn't equal C because everybody's bloody blind.
What happens outside the 50 miles that we've just been talking about? It's already pretty clear based on the radiation in the straw that we discovered that the radiation, even out as far as 50 miles, is as high in some areas as Chernobyl was. Well, what about further? Let's take a look at Tokyo, and I'm concerned there too. First, the sewage treatment plants in Tokyo have contaminated their sewage sludge. Now, normally that material is used in building construction material, but it's so radioactive it has to be stored outside under tarps until someone can figure out a way to get rid of it. The second thing is, a Japanese gentleman sent me a lab report. This person took it into their own hands to pay for a lab to analyze data on the street near a playground in Tokyo. Here's the lab report. It shows that there's 53,000 disintegrations per second in a kilogram, about 2.2 pounds of material on the side of a street near a playground in Tokyo. Now, this person was so concerned that they went to the mayor of that town, and the mayor said, "I'm not worried about it." Here's a citizen with his own money, paid for a lab report, and could get nowhere with his local government. Well, there's another piece of data, and that comes out of the National Cancer Center Hospital near Tokyo as well. It's been on their website since a couple days after the accident. The report shows that on March 24th, that's 9 days after the accident, the radioactive background outside the hospital was 30 times higher than the radioactive background inside the hospital. There was deposition of hot particles on the soil, and it was significant enough to increase the amount of radiation that the detectors were picking up by a factor of 30. Now, a National Cancer Hospital clearly knows how to measure radiation, so these are experienced scientists. Last report I want to share with you is every day I get an email from a prominent Japanese physicist named Dr. Glenn Saji. And he was their secretariat of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in Japan. And he wrote 2 days ago this, and it has to do with the straw that's been discovered near Fukushima. "I believe it is due to storing straw in a field at the time the plume passed by during the first week of the accident, in particular due to the black rain." Now, black rain is not a term I'm sure he uses lightly, but it clearly was experienced in Japan after the accident. What he's referring to there is clouds of radioactive particles, hot particles, depositing everywhere in northern Japan.
Meanwhile, over in Japan, TEPCO, the company that owns the Fukushima reactors, according to news reports, says that they want to dump almost 800,000 tons of highly radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. What's the story here?
Well, you know, the nuclear reaction, it creates all kinds of radioactive isotopes. This accident created tremendous amounts of, probably 120 different radioactive isotopes in the fissioning process. But one key one has been tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen. And the industry, in talking about what they're going to do with all this radioactive water, you can't filter tritium out because it is radioactive hydrogen and it's tritiated water. So they're talking about either dumping it into the ocean, or the other option is to vaporize it. But you create radioactive water vapor in that instance. But the industry likes to frame this stuff, tritium, as what they call a weak emitter. They like to frame it as harmless. But in fact, tritium, because it is radioactive hydrogen, it won't, as a beta emitter, it won't penetrate the skin. But if you ingest it or inhale it, it will then displace the normal natural hydrogen with radioactive hydrogen, and then it starts to incorporate at the most intimate biological levels, where it will start bumping hydrogen out of the DNA chain. And this then, when it's at that level, while it won't penetrate the skin, tritium itself is twice as effective as to do biological damage than X-rays or gamma radiation. So the next time you hear the industry claim that this is a harmless emitter, in fact, once it's incorporated into the biology, it's more effective than gamma radiation at destroying our genetic makeup.
Right. Which is a bad thing, A, for future generations, and B, for anyone who doesn't want to get cancer as a consequence of getting this.
Over 20 species now are near collapse. The halibut, the herring, the salmon. Not only did the salmon not come back last year, I think it was 80% of them didn't come back, but the young salmon that were born when those that did come back went up their streams of origin and were able to produce baby salmon before dying. The baby salmon, when they go out to sea, are dying en masse. And these imbecile, no, they're not imbeciles, they're cowards. These cowardly marine biologists will not say the R word. They say, well, something's causing acidification. There's a virus. They're lying. They're not telling the truth. No one will say it could be related to the radiation that's being dumped into the ocean around the clock for over 3.5 years now. They won't say that. I salute some of you folks in Alaska who are involved in the fishing industry. It took the fishermen up there to demand that the fish be tested for radioactivity. Not all the captains, just a few, but some did. And they found out what they suspected was there. Radiation bioaccumulating in the fish. Remember, 80% of the salmon didn't come back last year. We just got word the salmon, the babies, which were coming down out of the mountain streams where they were born into the salt water, were dying. What's killing them? All right? One captain said, this is the worst fishing he has ever seen. It's a catastrophe. Crabs, by the way, up there have turned blue. The herring, the cod, halibut, pollock. He said that the catches are literally dropping off a cliff. There aren't any. They're gone. They're dead. Prove me wrong. They're dead. They didn't migrate down to Chile. They're not hanging out down there, having a good time. They're dead. This is the death of the biggest ocean on the planet, the greatest catastrophe. Japan should be held fully accountable. So should General Electric. So should Toshiba or anyone else involved with this nightmare. All of them.
Subcontractors too that service. TEPCO is just an umbrella company.
Of course.
All of the companies that actually provided all of the technical and other support were all American companies, basically.
Yeah, a lot of the crabs being caught in Alaska, they're all dead. They bring them up and they're dead. So I mean, this is not a joke. This situation in Alaska, which was the breadbasket for fish and seafood, you're looking at right now, ladies and gentlemen, the death of seafood.
At what level? Here's a question I'm going to pose to everybody who lives from Seattle down to the Baja. And you send me an email, and seriously, I'm being as gently persuasive as I know how to be. At what level will you decide that that you can no longer stay on the coast? At what level? Go and look up, exposure levels to radiation. and look up, that some of this stuff is 530 sieverts, not millisieverts, sieverts an hour. And the thing is if you look at, lethal dose over a lifetime, I think most of the charts are 275, and that's over your lifetime. If you were exposed to just, thousands of this, they'd be treating you for radiation sickness. So that's why the fish are bleeding. Well, that's why they're being mutated. That's why everything's beaching. That's why they're dying. The food chain is interrupted. And ladies and gentlemen, when the plankton goes and when the sardines go all the way up the food ladder and the ocean, everything goes. And when the food goes, we go.
Yeah.